Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second day of the conference. We have a much emptier room today, and I think that's partly because the online participation was so effective yesterday that many people who were here have opted not to brave the traffic and actually just join virtually. So we've received many messages from people in Pretoria and other places, but of course we do have colleagues from Pretoria who have made it. In fact, I think Pleasure was one of the first people in the room this morning, all the way from Pretoria. So thank you once again for joining us this morning. My name is Mbongiseni Buthelezi. I'm the director of PARI. And I have a twofold role this morning. One is I've been asked to welcome you again, but especially people who were not here, who were unable to join us today. Welcome to this conference. We had wonderful conversations yesterday, very stimulating conversations, which we're going to take forward today. And the one thing that I really want to ask us to be doing through today is to be really harvesting for ourselves things that need to be done going forward, especially for the final session this afternoon, where we're going to be thinking about how do we take all of this that we've discussed in 2 days forward. What are the next steps? What actions do we need to take collectively? So I think as we go through the day, I would want to ask all of us to be paying attention to those things. We've received some proposals, we've got some ideas as the organizers of the conference about some of the things we want to do as the next steps, but the final session is for all of us to think collectively about what do we do next. And we're thinking about that also just to remind us that this is actually the third in a series of conferences we've hosted. First one was hosted by PARI in 2018. And I'm also very pleased to say that one of the actions that came out of that conference was that we started putting together an academic book on state capture. The manuscript went off to Vets Press yesterday morning. So that's, thank you. And out of this conference, one of the things we want to also do is to start putting together a collection on the commission itself. So that's the first part. The second part, briefly, is just to pull some threads from yesterday's conversation into this conversation today, and especially for the benefit of people who did not join us yesterday. Just to remind us of some of the threads that came out and some of the opportunities that were flagged for us. So our keynote speaker, Terence Nombembe, one of the things he pointed to is the fierce urgency, I think, of the moment we're in. And we all know this. Many of you in the room have talked about this in his opening address yesterday, in his welcoming remarks. Lawson talked about this as well. Terence, the way he put it was that what the commission exposed is something that is still happening today and happening in places that the commission did not get to. Now, as I left here yesterday afternoon, I listened to a report on 702 where Minister Senzo Mchunu was talking about some of the things that are happening in the Department of Water and Sanitation. And one of the things he was pointing to is that there's widespread destruction of water infrastructure in the country, with the involvement in some cases of even municipal managers and mayors, and they're destroying water infrastructure to create opportunities for their networks to supply water through water tankers. Now, there's one of the places that Nombembe was talking about. This is happening, it's been happening for years. And we saw particularly an inflection of this during COVID-19 in those early months when water was being supplied. So, Nombembe said, at the heart of this, of course, is greed. And he gave us a really pithy definition of greed as an intense and selfish desire for wealth and power. And he asked some pertinent questions that I think we need to, keep thinking about. Some of them included, how do we uproot such horrific conduct? He asked, are these things we can legislate against? And there are some opportunities for legislation that were flagged through the day yesterday. Can we have policy positions on these things and reverse them? He also said a lot of people are sitting on the fence, and we know this. there are a lot of people in our own networks who are sitting on the fence. There are people who are part of networks who are committed to certain political positions, who are sitting on the fence as a result of their own commitments, historic and present. Are there ways of incentivizing and consequent management, as well as what does change management look like to root out the kind of conduct that he was talking about? He also pointed out, of course, that one of the things the Commission didn't get to is the question of the capacity of law enforcement agencies, which we heard in the next panel, particularly from Michael Marchant, and talking about working across the jurisdictions and how difficult that is, but also the capacity of law enforcement to pursue some of the economic crimes that are taking place. That first panel on the private sector enablers of state capture, ? One of the key things that also were said was that we needed to take the question mark away, because the private sector, we can safely say, were enablers. Some parts of the private sector, some actors within the private sector were enablers of state capture. We heard that the private sector has been rattled by the findings of the Zondo Commission, and there's work that is being done. There are conversations that have started there. We heard that from Kaskuvadiya. We heard similarly from Gugu, McLaren, Oshewo, Kunze. Kas talked about guardrails that are being put in place, and that Abubusa, and also by extension, I suppose, BLSA are thinking through how to put guardrails up that are about being able to suspend members and being able to ask members to leave the association, but also being able to call them out publicly as a final step. Michael talked about the inconsistency of the Commission in treating some of the actors in the private sector. Some of the early findings were quite hard-hitting and quite clear, but some of the later ones let some of the actors off the hook. And he also reminded us that disbarment, paying back the money, should just be the baseline. And after that, there should still be investigations. People should be prosecuted. But I think critically also, Michael talked about what we need to think about is the social cost of the shenanigans that went on and continue to go on. Kaya's told us greed is good. Of course, that was to get our attention. But what he talked about is really how the whole system is designed, and competition is designed, is actually the base of the problem that we are facing at the moment. And how do we think through those things? What do we do as civil society? What do other actors do to try and reverse this tide? On public procurement, the second panel, we heard that our public procurement system is archaic. It's paper-based. It's focused a lot on tenders. Kenneth Brown, Alison Anthony told us this. We also heard from Alison that there's pervasive poor record keeping, which of course we hear every year from the Auditor General. The Commission's recommendations are focused on corruption and not delivery. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we hold the two things together? But particularly, how do we think about our public procurement system and delivery, which we've not been thinking much about. We've been talking quite a lot about the corruption side and how to close the taps. Kenneth Brown said a national emergency needs to be declared. We need to think of, for ourselves, I think, going forward, how, if a national emergency is declared, what might that look like? And what are the actions that then need to kick in almost immediately? Kenneth gave us some pointers around that. There was support for some of the recommendations of the Commission around whistleblowing, which we're going to pick up on today, around professionalization, which the last panel picked up on, around a national charter, even though charters are said to be not very effective, and around consequence management. But there was skepticism also about others, particularly the question of deferred prosecution agreements. There are opportunities, of course, we heard about. And one of those opportunities is that there is a public procurement bill that is making its way. It's currently at NETLEC. And we hope we can think again about how that we go forward. We have Lisa Seftel in the room who can perhaps, if she can, tell us where that process is and how we can use the opportunities that are arising from there to take work on the public procurement bill forward. There's also, something that Jonathan Calland talked about, as there are some opportunities for some form of limited centralization, but also we need to think about incentivized whistleblowing, which the Commission was not terribly supportive of. Zugiswa talked about how we need to also think about how to open up certain stages of the procurement process to public scrutiny, and as well as how to strengthen and resource civil society to participate effectively in those processes. And finally, the last panel of the day was on personnel practices in public administration. Here, of course, as we know, the key problem is politicization. What we heard in that panel is that politicization is not an ANC problem. The ANC has come to be the center of focus, of course, for two reasons. One, because it has a deployment committee, but also because the DA has opportunistically launched litigation against the ANC's practices. We heard that professionalization has been baked into our system. It's been part of the discussion almost from the inception of our democratic system. This is what Professor Maserumule talked about. And we also heard, which we also know, that our laws exclude the introduction of political criteria into appointment processes. However, even though we have a system that on paper is well designed, in practice, things have gone awry, as we all know. The exclusion of political criteria has never been achieved. The professionalization that panelists were talking about has not been achieved. And the question that was asked by Professor Maserumule and Dr. Maja is, why is it that it was only in 2020 that recommendations that are in the National Development Plan and in other policy positions, green papers previously, are only being taken seriously and starting a serious discussion of how to professionalize the public service. There are opportunities, of course. We heard Fatima Rawat said what the recommendations of the Commission on the public service need to be extended as well to local government, and that we need the Public Service Commission to play a bigger and more central role in selection, in appointment processes. The opportunities that exist, we were told that there's the Ministerial Task Team report that is before Cabinet for adoption. I served on that Ministerial Task Team. I think that task team report, if it is adopted by the Cabinet, if it's not watered down, I think will give us a very good tool for advocacy that we can use. There are also two pieces of legislation that are currently being amended. The Public Service Amendment Bill is in process, as well as the Public Administration Laws Amendment Bill. And we need to think, I think, in that last session, again, how do we take advantage of these opportunities? As Fatima Rawat told us, it's a collective process in which civil society also needs to play a critical role. With that, I'm going to stop here, and I once again thank you for joining us and welcome. And I'm going to turn over to Lindiwe.
Good morning, everyone, again. I hope you had a good night's sleep last night. I'm not going to take a long time, but for those that are joining us today, the bathrooms are right in front of the registration tables, if you didn't notice. And then just a reminder on your cell phones, if you've used your Waze to get here, tell it you've arrived, and then silence those cell phones. And then I would like to just implore on our speakers and facilitators today that for the speakers, if there's something you can leave for the discussion later, let's do that as you speak, because we just want to give a little bit more time for discussions. I mean, we saw yesterday that just how much discussion was required. So if the facilitators can watch time, obviously very gently, and I'll let the speakers when their time is over, but for the speakers for that. And then also to welcome our participants that are and speakers that are joining us virtually. So with that, I'd like to call the first panel to come up. Lawson, if you can come up. We've got, yeah, with the panels that are joining you, Mr. Pikoli, Ms. Marianne. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good morning again, and welcome to you all. This is a panel on titled Establishing an Anti-Corruption Agency in View of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and its Recommendations. I think it became apparent in the course of some of the discussion yesterday that the reports of the Zondo Commission have not really focused on law enforcement agencies. It was one of the things that the Chief Justice said he did not have sufficient time to turn his attention to in any sort of detail. But there are some recommendations in the report about anti-corruption agencies and so on. And we touched on one of those to some extent yesterday when we were discussing procurement reform, because there's a proposal for a public procurement anti-corruption agency in the report. And it's a sort of standalone proposal that comes through in the report. And then obviously there's also the other significant recommendation is that effectively the state capture inquiry should become a standing inquiry, a permanent structure that is there perennially. One of the stark things that comes out of the report is that there was no interrogation or discussion of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy itself. And that's, I think, rather alarming, given that this was a strategy adopted by Cabinet in November of 2020 and has put in place some serious proposals around how to combat corruption. And as we know, the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Committee, which David Lewis, sitting here to my right, is a member, and which I'm sure David will tell us all about in a few minutes. So I'm not going to say much more about that. But it's really to try and pull together the threads of this and see how it relates to the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and what kind of institutional architecture we need going forward in combating corruption and state capture. So the three panelists that I have with me today are all experts in the field and need little introduction. First up, we will have David Lewis, who, as you sure all know, is the former Executive Director of Corruption Watch, and as I just mentioned, has just been appointed as one of the 9 members of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. David also chaired the Civil Society and Government co-chaired the Civil Society and Government Reference Group that developed the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. And I was privileged to have served as part of that reference group and to make that a contribution towards that process. We're also joined online by Vusi Pikoli, as you will know, former head of the National Prosecuting Authority, and he's served a number of other senior roles in the state, including as Director General of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, as a commissioner in the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry into the Police, and he's currently a senior advisor to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and a member of its Africa board. Now, I know Kaya Sitole, who I don't see here today, but he was very specific about remembering dates from 50 years ago yesterday. Now, my memory is not quite that good, but I think it's almost to the day, Vusi. We may be a few days short, but it's 15 years since Vusi was suspended as the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and it resulted in the appointment of the Genwala inquiry, which I served on, and therefore can claim to know Vusi rather well, because we had to peer into every aspect of his performance as the National Director in order to determine his fitness to hold office. So welcome, Vusi. The third panelist we have with us today is Marianne Camerer, as a senior lecturer at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. Marianne has worked as an applied policy researcher on corruption and governance and co-founded the international anti-corruption NGO Global Integrity. She's recently been appointed to the board of Corruption Watch and is a trustee of the Institute for Security Studies, and someone who has, over a very long period of time, given considerable thought and has written extensively on what South Africa's approach to combating corruption ought to be. So that's setting the scene for you. We're going to ask David Lewis to go first and give us his remarks. David.
Great. Thanks, Lawson, and hi, everybody. Yesterday was a really stimulating day, I thought, and I hope today will be as well. So the Zondo Commission's recommendations from an institutional perspective, and I draw largely, I have to say, on Devi's incredibly useful summary of the recommendations. But there are, as far as I could glean, and there may be more. There are three institutional recommendations in the Zondo Commission. The one is for a permanent commission of some unspecified sort. To the extent it was specified, it was said to be doing the same work as the Zondo Commission, which is a pretty terrifying thought from just about every perspective. The second was a proposal for an anti-corruption procurement agency. And the third was an institution that will be responsible for appointing senior state officials. The ones mentioned are the boards of CEOs and the boards of state-owned enterprises and the CEOs of those enterprises. And I presume that would also have been extended to directors general and appointments at that level. And so I'll reflect very briefly on those three. In fact, two were discussed in a fair amount of detail yesterday, but I think bear talking about again. And they dovetail with the potential work or the intended work of this newly appointed National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. I've been asked to say here, in the spirit of democratic centralism, these are my views, not necessarily those of the members of the advisory council, but I'm going to try and make them prevail. Firstly, in the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which is something that I urge you all to read, the publicization of it, partly because of COVID, partly because of GCIS, has really been inadequate, because we actually do have here a very comprehensive anti-corruption strategy. I'm sure it can be improved. I'm sure that there are things that are wrong and there are things that are missing, but it certainly provides the basis for a very substantial discussion on anti-corruption strategy. And the one thing left out of the anti-corruption strategy and intended precisely for this advisory council is to advise on the institutional form that a new anti-corruption agency will or should take. And that was identified as the priority task of this council, and that suggests something that I think the public don't know yet. The response to this anti-corruption council has been overwhelmingly cynical, and I don't really blame people, the public, for expressing that cynicism. I'm not sure how much more cynical they would be if they realized that this is an interim body appointed for 3 years to set up the real body that will follow on the recommendations, hopefully made by the council to the president. So I'll talk about that, which dovetails well with the mandate given this council by the president in his appointment letter of the 9 members. And the 2 elements of that dovetail well are, firstly, he says we need to examine the proposals of the Zondo Commission, as he puts it, from a strategic and systemic perspective. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I presume it does include the sort of institutional recommendations as opposed to the prosecutorial recommendations. And he also mandates the council with the task of examining the anti-corruption architecture of the state, which would definitely include a new anti-corruption agency, but also, I presume, the agencies recommended by Zondo. So to just go over all that, the agencies recommended by Zondo, which, as I say, we discussed in some detail yesterday, but I think that they bear re-examining. So the first is for this anti-corruption procurement agency. And, you heard yesterday, and you heard particularly Kenneth Brown saying that this should not be, if there is to be such an agency, it should not be an anti-corruption agency, it should be a procurement agency of some sort or another, with which I agree. And I think it may be a good idea. It would have to be a very substantially resourced agency with investigators, litigators, the whole gamut of a sort of quasi law enforcement agency that I presume would receive reports from the public, particularly as will be the case, those members of the public who had bid for state contracts and had been denied them for reasons that were not obvious to them. And this is what happens today. And this agency, I guess, would be professionally equipped to do those kind of investigations. I was fascinated by Kenneth's remark at the end when the question of the fragmentation of the procurement system was discussed, when he said that it's not a binary choice necessarily. There may be certain aspects of procurement that are centralized while others remain decentralized. And, if one remembers the history of why procurement was decentralized, largely to bring procurement closer to the places at which the products and services actually procured were used to promote local economic development. So there are some good reasons for decentralization. But instead of decentralization, I think it has become real fragmentation. And I think impossible for the Treasury or whoever else is meant to exercise oversight from what I understood Kenneth to say yesterday, 1 million nodes of production, 1 million nodes of procurement. So, quite clearly, one of the things that will have to be worked out in that agency, if it's to be established, and I do think it's a good idea, would be to establish what is appropriately centralized and what is decentralized, and is the investigation of irregularities, corruption, mismanagement, is this part of the centralized function? And I would think it would be. So that would be part of an addition, if you like, to the anti-corruption architecture. On the appointment, the proposal that there should be a state appointments body established, I feel very strongly that this is actually a very good idea. You know, at Corruption Watch, and I think it's common across many people who've examined this, you know, we were of the firm view. I still talk about Corruption Watch as we, but I mean they were of the firm view that the appointment process was absolutely the key element in the state capture project. You know, the appointments of boards, chairs of SOEs, the executive suite of SOEs, directors general, all of these of particular departments of government, mining, for example, minerals and mining, that precisely the kinds of departments that the Gupta targets in the state were interested in, were the appointments were made in such a way as to facilitate the state capture saga. And so I think that it is a really good idea to place appointments in the hands of some kind of, you know, dare I say it, blue ribbon panel, pool of people with unimpeachable integrity, some degree of human resource experience, and obviously from time to time, if you're appointing, you know, you're appointing somebody to do a contract to build a nuclear power station, you don't appoint people with who are expert in procuring stationery. So there would have to be technical expertise on these committees as well. And I think you appoint a pool of, you know, even 30 or 40 people from whom you could draw and you could co-opt expertise onto making these appointments. I think that is an excellent recommendation, and I think should really be pursued. And you know, taking it out of the hands of the, if you like, of the government of the day, although there should probably be a high-level representative of the government on each of these panels, because again, we discussed the whole deployment saga yesterday. And I think that the government is entitled to require that appointees generally support the strategies and the approach of the government of the day. I remember Trevor Manuel once saying that he had never appointed anybody who did not support the proposals of the government of the day, or the position of the government of the day, but he'd also never appointed anybody who was second best in terms of competency. So those two things are not necessarily at odds with each other at all. But I think it needs to be taken out of only the government of the day. Some of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission sort of rang alarm bells for me. Like, for example, they said appoint CEOs and chief financial officers. I think it's a very bad idea for one body to appoint an employee who is accountable to another person. And so if the CFO of a state-owned enterprise reports to the CEO, it should be the state-owned enterprise that makes that appointment, not some other body to whom senior people are responsible. But you know, we iron out those difficulties, because it happens today that ministers appoint CFOs and procurement officers and the like. in certain instances. And the CEO then has no power in relation to them because he or she knows that they have the endorsement and the approval of the minister. So those issues need to be ironed out in the appointment process. But I think that's an excellent idea. And then there's the proposal for this kind of, if you like, permanent Zondo commission. And I want to say something about that in some detail, because I think that this is really the closest recommendation to what a new agency should do. And I should emphasize again that I don't think that if the procurement agency proposal is followed, I don't think that should be a responsibility of the new agency, if there is to be one. And as for the appointment process, it might well be that the new agency can provide secretariat type services to the appointments committee or pool. But again, I think it should be a separate responsibility. So what about the new agency? Zondo doesn't give too many clues about what it is he expects from it, except to say that he suggests that it should be a replica in some form or another of the Zondo Commission itself. But let me discuss that, because as I said, the one big omission of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy is to specify what the institutional structure of a new agency that is supported by the National Anti-Corruption Strategy should look like. And we on the reference group, of whom both Lawson and I formed part, that negotiated or discussed this with representatives of civil society on the one side and government on the other side. And I must say here, an exemplar of the good things that can come out of compacts between government and civil society. It was really an incredibly sort of admirable process. I mean, when you closed your eyes in those meetings, sometimes you couldn't tell whether it was the government speaking or civil society speaking. And their views were very strongly aligned over periods. Even when we had Robert McBride as the co-chair, we achieved consensus over. We achieved consensus over a lot of stuff. But not over the form that the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, the new agency should take. And there are a number of debates already, thankfully, emerging amongst members of the public as to what form this should take. And they range from nothing at all, why do we need another agency kind of approach, which is the common person's view, if you like, right through to a fully fledged Chapter 9 institution with law enforcement powers. And I agree with neither end of the spectrum. I think that we do need a new agency. Just because we've had a lot of agencies and they've failed doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a new agency. And currently the government, the state's agency nominally coordinating anti-corruption activity is the Anti-Corruption Task Team, which is headed by by law enforcement. I think still by the head of the Hawks and the head of the NPA, and includes everybody but the kitchen sink. It includes all the law enforcement agencies, SARS, FIC, IPID, the police, the Hawks, the NPA, as well as a range of government departments like the GCIS, the Department of Public Administration. And it's a complete dog's breakfast of an institution that has never achieved the objective of coordinating it. And this is not something that I'm saying, it's something that I recall both Shamila Batoy and General Labia saying to the reference group. It's been a failure. and it would be an interesting and important task of the new council to look at why it has been a failure. And I think one of the reasons it's been a failure is because it included both law enforcement and non-law enforcement bodies. And I believe very strongly that the new agency should not include law enforcement, and that for a variety of reasons. For one thing, I think it would enormously restrict the public access that the council have to the public. So, you know, the requirements in law enforcement for agencies like the FIC, the Prosecutorial Authority, the Hawks, the requirements for confidentiality are very strong. And the requirement that no one interfere with their decision-making process, also very strong. And if they were incorporated into the new council would have to be, to be effective, the new council would, the other activities, other anti-corruption activities would have to be subordinated to the law enforcement requirements for confidentiality. So public campaigns, media statements, all the stuff that allows the public to develop a sense of confidence and a sense of engagement with anti-corruption activities would be stymied because law enforcement's requirements for confidentiality would have to be respected. This is not to mention the fact that setting up a Chapter 9 institution like this would require at least 2 constitutional amendments, not least of all one of the constitutional requirements giving the NPA monopoly over prosecutorial activities. And it requires, you know, a very elaborate legislative structure. I think the new body has to have a statutory basis. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why the anti-corruption task team has failed, because it has no formal statutory basis. But I don't know that, I'll just read 2 more minutes. I don't know if if a Chapter 9 institution is necessary. I mean, one of the arguments for a Chapter 9 institution is that it's more the constitutional protection given to its senior officer is greater. It can't simply be disbanded in the way the Scorpions were disbanded. The head of the agency, as we discover with the public protector, can't simply be fired, which, as we've seen, is both an advantage and a disadvantage. So I don't think that there's a real magic bullet, some sort of silver bullet that is assigned to a Chapter 9 institution. But, you know, we'll hear debate about it. There's a very strong view from some quarters that this should be the case. But I think that principally the new agency should be involved in stuff like advocacy, research, the mounting of public campaigns. And I think we have to be very ambitious about that. I mean, certainly the experience of Corruption Watch was that its successes, and I think there were several, had a large amount to do with a very active communications strategy. And I think we need to be ambitious about the kind of public campaigns we fight. I mean, you know, for example, yesterday, Terence Nombembe mentioned the issue of greed. We have to think, you know, could we deal with greed, with ethical issues, and bear in mind that corruption is not only a crime, but sometimes it's not a crime at all, but it's ethically very questionable. It constitutes ethically questionable conduct. Could we mount a public campaign dealing with behavior change? We did it quite successfully in the HIV/AIDS campaigns. We've done it over other things. It requires budgets, I acknowledge, of tens of millions of rands, maybe even hundreds of millions of rands. I don't think that the state communications agency is well equipped to deal with it. I would frankly rather hand that money out to NGOs and see what they could do with it. But I'm not pessimistic about the possibility of mounting a behavior change campaign. And I think it's these kinds of things that the new agency should be doing. And, you know, to say finally that one of the very important things that it needs to be doing is to be maintaining really strong relationship with the people in the organizations who are in this room, which again is not a strong suit of law enforcement. And another reason why law enforcement should not be in this body. There needs to be a strong relationship between this body and law enforcement. That's for certain. But they shouldn't be responsible for hardcore law enforcement decisions that involve investigations and that involve prosecutions. So that's what I have to say, and thank you.
Thank you, David. That's a wide-ranging assessment of the landscape and the challenges in particular that the NACS is going to face in the next 3 years. Vusi Pikoli, are you online? Morning, Vusi. Welcome.
Morning. Good morning. Good morning.
You may proceed, Vusi.
Yes. Good morning, Lawson, and my fellow panelists, Dave and Marianne, and everybody else in the room and on the virtual platform. I will try to be brief so that we can have more discussions. There's a lot to be said, you know, but much more to be done when it comes to these matters. Let me start off by quoting President Ramaphosa in his foreword to the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. He says, corruption wherever it occurs represents a decline in our value system as a nation. If left unchecked, it poses a grave threat to our democratic values and our dream of being an ethical and developmental state. Well, these are quite aspiring words indeed, but are they matched by the deeds of government and society as a whole? This is something which we need to seriously think about, given the fact that South Africa is not short of policy positions on corruption. We are not short of legislation to deal with issues of corruption. We are not short of oversight and regulatory bodies when it comes to corruption matters. But where we fall short, I want to argue, is on having a resolute political will on the part of those occupying public office. And this also extends to the heads of the various institutions that are tasked with anti-corruption matters. Now, there's no gainsaying the fact that, you know, in the last 10 years, we have had an erosion of state institutions, particularly in the criminal justice sector. And this is what enabled and facilitated this massive corruption that we are experiencing today. That's why the question of establishing a single independent anti-corruption agency has never been more urgent. We therefore need to really apply our minds and talk about, you know, the actual mandate of the single independent anti-corruption agency that we're talking about. We need not go far in our history and cast our minds back to the time when we had the DSO established in terms of Section 7 of the National Prosecuting Authority Act. We don't have to reimagine, new notions or concepts or structures. In this country, we did have an effective directorate that was able to deal with organized crime and corruption. I won't go to the extent of its successes because it depends from where one comes from. But the truth is that it was an effective directorate which instilled fear in the hearts and minds of criminals. Judge Kambembe, when she was given the task of inquiring into the mandate and location of the DSO, didn't have any problems in having the DSO located in the NPA. Though she did make some recommendations insofar as the policing aspect of it, that the Minister of Police, then Safety and Security, was to have a role insofar as the investigators are concerned. But if we're to cast our mind back again, the DSO investigators had special investigators who had the same powers as police officials. Powers of subpoena, powers of search and seizure, powers of arrest, powers of disposal of assets, and quite a number of powers that made that directorate, an effective directorate as it was. So, yes, there's lots of talk about establishing another anti-corruption agency along the lines of Chapter 9 institutions. This is the argument advanced by Advocate Paul Hoffman, for instance, in Accountability Now, and there's some other people who are calling for possibility of establishing yet another Chapter 9 institutions. For me, that would be missing the point here. I've counted not less than 8 relevant pieces of legislation that we have in our country that seek to deal with issues of corruption. You have got your PRECA, you have got PAIA, PAJA, PFMA, MFMA, Public Audit Act, you have got FICA, you have got POCA. And then you've got quite a number of other bodies and state entities, numbering as much as 13. So we've got a proliferation of a number of structures that seek to deal with one problem and one problem only, corruption. And I want also to include the question of organized crime, because we can't address effectively issues of corruption outside of organized crime, particularly transnational organized crime. That's why South Africa is a signatory and has ratified quite a number of UN conventions, including the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, who are also signatories and have ratified the OECD Convention against bribery of foreign public officials in public international transactions, who are signatories to the AU Convention Against Corruption, the SADC protocols, and so many others. We've got this beautiful array of policy and legislative framework, and yet we're still grappling with effective ways and methods of dealing with this. I think we should stop, being ambivalent on what we want to do and achieve. And we need to learn from the best, practices that we have had as a country There was a time when South Africa was looked upon as one of those countries, that present a model insofar as fighting corruption. Coming back to the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which envisages, its implementation in 2 phases. The first phase is the one that has just been put in place by the president, where Dave serves the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which is not meant to be a permanent structure at this stage, but it's meant to be in existence for 2 years, and to make proposals that will then lead to the second phase, that of a permanent, independent, and overarching statutory or constitutional state entrust body. So it would seem that the advisory council is transitional in nature, is going to make proposals to cabinet on the establishment of the overarching body. Now, contrast this with what Justice Zondo recommends, where he speaks of the establishment of a single, multifunctional, properly resourced and independent anti-corruption authority. I agree with him insofar as that is concerned. But when he adds and says, with a mandate to confront abuses of public procurement, then he loses me altogether. And unfortunately, I have to point out that Judge Zondo seems to also have misread or misunderstood the Glenister judgment, Glenister 2 and Glenister 3 judgments. He quotes a majority judgment and makes it as if it's the minority judgment that he says in his report. And yet that's the majority judgment in terms of ensuring that South Africa needs an independent anti-corruption agency. And the amendments of the SAPS Act in establishing the DPCI fall short of that expected standard in terms of the independence of the DPCI. And is the judgment, the majority judgment is 5-4, it's split in 5-4, with Moepeng and Cameroon making the majority judgment there, and Judge Ngcobo coming up with his own judgment, which argues that the DPCI is adequately independent. But finally, the Concord, upheld the challenge to that, which was brought by Glenister, to say that the DPCI is not adequately independent, not necessarily talking of a full or total independence of such a body. So, in short, I want to argue and say that, we can be able to establish a single independent anti-corruption agency within the framework of the National Prosecuting Authority. And that would be perfectly constitutional, particularly if we were to reinstate the repealed Section 30 of the NPA Act that speaks to the appointment of special investigators with police powers. But to make sure that it will be independent, we must deal also with certain sections of Section 7, where it talks of the president establishing by proclamation an independent directorate. Of course, on the recommendation of the Minister of Police and the Minister of Justice together with the NTPP, because that then will temper with the required adequate independence of such a body. So in short, I would like us to really start this conversation about the mandate of this anti-corruption agency as well as its location. I'll come back, Lawson, but I thought I should just raise those few issues for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Vusi, for that. I mean, I think the emphasis on the independence of an anti-corruption body is critical, and I think Vusi has articulated that very well. So, you know, there's been talk now. Vusi ended up by talking about, you know, the presidential proclamations, and we have the investigating directorate within the NPA, which has been established precisely by that presidential proclamation. And we hear the Minister of Justice just a couple of days ago beginning to talk about the ID becoming a permanent body through some sort of statutory process. So I think it's very much along the lines of what Vusi has outlined. But now, Marianne, over to you for your input, please.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be on this panel with people who really do know what they're talking about, having been at the coalface of combating and preventing corruption. So I really appreciate, and I'm cognizant of how complex this issue is, and also the time that we have left on this panel. But I was invited by Sarah from Parry to bring in a bit of a comparative perspective. And I think that's important to recognize. We're not the first country to have tried to figure this out. There are extraordinary resources to draw on in this regard. We're going to have to create something which is homegrown. I think the Zondo Commission is a very interesting example to draw on. But I came across this, you probably know this quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Or not, because in October 1997, the Interdepartmental Committee on Corruption of the South African Cabinet was recommending that Cabinet consider establishing an independent and centralized anti-corruption agency, and it looked to various examples. So we've been here before, you see, if you have that sense of history, but the main point, I think, is that we need to get on with it. And David, part of civil society will be monitoring what I see as the most important function of the NACS, which is the implementation and oversight of South Africa's national anti-corruption strategy. And it's a very, very powerful document. And so while NACS has a number of tasks, I see that as the most important, is implementing the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which was signed off in October or November the 20th, 2020. And the National Anti-Corruption Strategy goes from 2020 to 2030. So while you might have an interim advisory council who's going to do its work and also advise on the institutional architecture and their various models that we can already draw on, the most important thing for me is the active implementation and oversight of the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. So while in a way the Zondo reports may have delayed the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, I think they may have strengthened the work as well of NACS, because I think having laid it out very clearly in 7 paragraphs, in 3 pages, what he calls the South African State Capture and Anti-Corruption Commission is a very bold statement of putting what needs to be on the table, which is a permanent structure, and a permanent structure who is solely focused on anti-corruption, on preventing and combating corruption. And we have not had that. In 2001, the Public Service Commission, and where are they is a good question to ask, they looked at a review of South Africa's national anti-corruption architecture, and there were 10 agencies at that point. Now we know there are more than 14, all are doing different things in this incredibly complex institutional matrix. But I think we need to look to some international normative frameworks which we have signed up to. As you know, in 1997, there was this proposal to look at a single agency, which didn't go far. But in 2003, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, in Article 6, which is about setting up an independent body to prevent corruption, independent body or bodies, and Article 36, an independent body or bodies to combat corruption, we signed up to that. And that's what Glenister draws on. And so in terms of the Constitution, in terms of the law, in terms of meeting our international legal responsibilities as a member of the international community, it's not a question of if we're going to have a permanent, independent agency which focuses on prevention and combating of corruption. That is what we've signed up for. And so there are quite interesting experiences from around the world of the 150 anti-corruption agencies, which in this very interesting report by the UNODC, which came out at the height of COVID, it's a commentary by practitioners and experts from around the world on implementing what are called the Jakarta principles, which are 16 aspirational design principles on how you set up an independent anti-corruption agency, because that is what's going to make the fight against corruption effective. And if one looks just in terms of what the functions, the multifunctionality of such a body, there is the prevention part of it. And prevention, in terms of what that actually means, is about leading efforts. You need a lead agency with the right leadership to lead efforts, to implement, to oversee, possibly coordinate, but at least focus on the prevention, because I think by the time it gets to enforcement, it's too late. And if you pick up on what happened what some of the themes from yesterday around, greed and moral behavior, we need prevention in terms of education, in terms of public awareness, in terms of outreach. The successes of effective anti-corruption agencies around the world are premised on public support. The public, what did they see in Zondo? They saw it every day. It was transparent. It was excruciating in some cases to just see the state we are in. It's not a pretty state. So whether the public is up to stomach more of that is a question. I asked my master's students earlier this week what they thought of another anti-corruption agency, because we've been exploring models. And there was a sense, but hold on, it's time for implementation. We do have existing laws and frameworks. So the prevention aspect, and I hear you, David, in terms of education and awareness and research and monitoring. How are we going to even know that it's been effective, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy? And I think there is a role for research and independent academics also to look at monitoring the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. And then, of course, there's the enforcement part of it. And in the models which are cited from around the world, there are many of these models which do not include prosecution. There's a recognition that you are walking into an institutional landscape where already there may be an independent prosecuting authority. And so that needs to be recognized. The investigative part of it and doing and calling people to come and investigate and inquiries, the law enforcement part of this does need to be strengthened. But most importantly is the institutional coordination. Because what we've heard about ACT is that had challenges, and I think that's a very important point, is what, is it about turf wars? Is it about political will? The recognition that state institutions, law enforcement agencies were captured. Are they now uncaptured? How do we strengthen the existing institutional architecture? So in terms of the Zondo recommendations, it is a little bit confusing. From a lay person or even someone who's been working in this area, there's suddenly a talk of an anti-corruption agency, and then it's, okay, that's about procurement. Then there's a talk of another anti-corruption, South Africa anti-corruption authority. And that's, it's quite scant, the amount of time and attention spent on that. What I found interesting is this idea of also looking at Parliament. There's a strong sense in what Judge Zondo says in the recommendations is, who guards the guards? And Parliament failed, and we'll have a panel later today on parliamentary oversight. But there's something, David, you said, it's terrifying it needs to be terrifying. People need to be terrified and quake in their boots. And if you have a legitimate, independent law enforcement authority, which is effectively combating, I'm focusing on the combating of corruption part of it, that people are scared, that it has shifted. Who is scared? Who worries? Who sleeps at night? And we haven't had the effective implementation of law enforcement to fight corruption. That's part of it. But in terms of the commitment and institutional resourcing and expertise to prevent corruption in terms of education, in terms of awareness raising, we need a permanent structure. And I think this moment of urgency and crisis, which the Zondo Commission brought to light, it's now or never. That's my sense. Thank you.
Look, I think the three panelists have sort of really captured the essence of what's necessary in an anti-corruption response. It's not just about law enforcement. It's very important, as we heard yesterday, and as Marianne's just emphasized, the preventive nature of anti-corruption strategies is a key part of that process, together with what David mentioned earlier, which is the public awareness side of things and changing the ethical culture within our society. So I think we've had a range of contributions, and I now open it up to the floor and to our participants online. Any hands up, questions or comments? One, two, three. Let me take those three in that order. We start with the gentleman with the white cap.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be short and sweet. My name is Ali. I was invited here as an activist. All my life, I've been working with people on the ground, and fortunately, at one stage, I was a ward councillor, and I still work with a lot of people. I've learned a lot from yesterday, including today. But I'm trying to paint a picture which, up to now, no one has painted. It's very short. Growing up in the township, my mom used to bring vegetables, those that you buy with mixed vegetables in one bag. I don't see they sell a lot of that now. There's a pumpkin, there's carrots. I don't know why they were selling it like that. And every time he alighted from the taxi, I had to go and assist her. I hated that bag. But I did not hate it when it was on a plate, because now it's food, especially on Sundays. Then it made me realize that when it's vegetables, raw vegetables, and when it's on the plate as food, it's two different things. A lot of people sitting in this room and those that are connecting to us virtually are aware of the big terms we're using, your compliance, your procurement orders, this and that. Does it dawn to us that as much as we are correct, you cannot relate that story to the ordinary person on the ground? We've got a lot of people who are unemployed, relying on 350 monthly grants from the government, that are facing all sorts of challenges, seeing raw sewage in front of their houses, people who toy every day without access to water, without housing, that see these things on television, that money is being stolen. Sorry, I'm not going to sugarcoat it that about money being misappropriated, SIM phone discrepancies. Money is being stolen. If we have not learned anything from last year's unrest, we are sitting on a time bomb. And when it explodes, no one of us is safe. It's good to have these conferences, but until we walk the talk and take the resolution, implement it as soon as yesterday, something will happen. I may be dreaming very soon. And when that happens, no one is safe. I hope that those of us who live behind the high, big walls, the walls are not also surrounding our minds. The walls, those fences are also not surrounding our thinking. We must now, as soon as possible, start to implement these things and arrest people so that ordinary people can see that justice and law still exist. The perception that is created that there was a state capture, there were things, there were money that was stolen, but no one is getting arrested, that does not augur well with an unemployed person, that billions are lost, but the person is only entitled to 350. The councillor is not coming to them. The president is not saying anything. The president is sleeping with money under the mattresses. All those issues, one day they will explode if these conferences and these agencies, this commission don't implement into actions. That's my input.
Thanks. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, and for anyone on the panel, please feel free to take up these points, a question on the sort of the politics of anti-corruption. So I guess the panel spoke a great deal about the vacuum sort of like of anti-corruption structures and how they might be filled. But I wanted to ask about the potential capture of anti-corruption. Anti-corruption being as much a form of politics as corruption itself. They both arise at particular times to serve particular ends. I'm thinking again, I spoke yesterday, but I think again of Brazil and how anti-corruption was captured there to stage a coup that ousted a democratically elected government and protected right-wing politicians. In India, the BJP mobilized around anti-corruption to oust the Congress party. And just like that, in the words of somebody I was speaking to this morning, here come the fascists. So, and we also don't have to go abroad for these sorts of examples. Before they were the public champions of the corrupt, the EFF used anti-corruption very effectively to criticize the Zuma government. The list of corrupt leaders from the labor movement who've used anti-corruption is a long one. So I just wanted anybody on the panel to speak to this. And then just one more point about anti-corruption, to my reading, and I'd love to hear the thoughts of anyone, doesn't seem to be very to be attractive. There's no sort of like sustained popular movement around anti-corruption, and whether or not this is something that we should be worried about. 2017, there was this moment against Zuma where there seemed to be real popular energy around an anti-corruption movement, but that could be said, I think it could be argued that was as much a question of like inter-ANC struggles as much as it was a struggle around anti-corruption. But whether or not we should be worried about the fact that anti-corruption doesn't seem to have a great sort of currency, a popular currency, as something to organize around on a mass scale. Thank you.
Thanks very much to a really great panel and input. The first comment is just on the discussion of a potential procurement sort of body or agency. I mean, I agree that I think the suggestion for that to focus solely on anti-corruption is not what we need, and what we need is the kind of agency you're talking about here, and then we need a separate, properly empowered procurement regulator with proper oversight capacity, enforcement capacity, and so forth. If that were to happen, I mean, the bill that the public saw in 2020 doesn't make for that kind of provision. It still locates that in the office, an office in the National Treasury. And it does need to be elevated. But we've had a lot of debate in Parry about, the risks of taking that out of the Treasury and making it an independent body, because it will become the major site for state capture. So if we do end up having such an agency, it will be so vital for civil society to watch, to see how we insulate that agency and how we appoint people to that agency. Because, in Parry, we haven't made a final decision about whether we actually should take it out of the Treasury. Because if that body had been out of the Treasury 5 years ago, we would have been in deep, deep trouble. And then the second point is around just the NACS. It hasn't been well publicized. It's up to civil society, and the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture, I think, is a key site to support that, to give it a lot of public status. It's really the only way, I think, that you're going to be empowered to do your job. So, yeah. And just to say, Lawson, we've got a lot of questions online. So, yeah.
I'm going to Devi right now. Devi?
Okay, we have quite a few questions online. The first one, I'm going to sort of amalgamate a couple of comments that seem to be heading in the same direction. So David Bruce, who's echoed by a couple of other people, says that he's concerned that the debate about the National Anti-Corruption Agency has displaced attention away from a discussion about what can be done to strengthening the existing institutions that are involved in addressing corruption. So, for example, would it not be important to do more to strengthen the SIU, which is one of our more effective anti-corruption agencies, such as strengthening the legislative framework, and so on and so forth. Now, the second question is from Karam Singh from Corruption Watch. He says, if we were to transition from a multi-agency model to a dedicated anti-corruption agency, could the panel envision an amalgamation of various agencies, such as the SIU, FIC, Hawks, and the ID, into a single dedicated elite investigative body? How do we feel about changing the constitution to remove the MPA's monopoly on prosecutions? And then one last question from Karam. How do we assess the work of the SIU Special Tribunal? Should we have a dedicated anti-corruption court?
All of those questions. Let me start with Vusi Pikoli online. Vusi, I hope you were able to hear all of those.
Yes. Thank you, Lawson. I appreciate the point made by Ali there, talking about the impatience of our people when it comes to matters of corruption. And indeed, we are sitting, on a time bomb, unless we really, do something about it, not just talk about all these policy framework legislation that we have put in place, but actually doing something about them, doing proper investigations. So I perfectly agree with that. If we're to look, for instance, at the immediate actions of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, amongst other things, it talks to taking immediate action on public procurement issues relating to COVID-19 procurement, to deal with the security criminal justice system and a cleanup of a campaign at SOEs. Now, these matters do not require the Zondo Commission recommendations. This is work which should ordinarily be done by the law enforcement agencies, on a daily basis, because they are given that task of dealing with these matters. And yet we are experiencing all these delays. But to be fair, we must take into account that, the DPCI and the NPA have lost the necessary skills that are required for purposes of proper investigations. And even the NPA has lost quite a number of prosecutors who are skilled and experienced, in dealing with these matters. So it is important that we start building the capacity of all these institutions. If I were perhaps to jump to another question that had arisen, the one that deals with the question of strengthening the current institutions. You see, before we start strengthening the current institutions, we should start making a proper assessment of their capacity and whether they are effectively placed as independent anti-corruption authorities. The SIU is doing quite a great job, but the SIU does not qualify to be an independent institution, given the fact that it relies on a presidential proclamation before it can actually carry out its work. Now, if it depends on executive authority, then the question of its independent existence and capacity is a question mark. The NPA has lost skills, which it must start building those skills, attracting lots of expertise in terms of training and specialization to make it a fully capacitated body. This includes even the question of the asset forfeiture unit. Yes, ideally, we should be talking about, the consolidation of all these structures that, are all over the place to make sure that we pull in all those resources that lie in the various institutions into one powerful and fully capacitated and resourced agency to be able to deal with these matters. And you might not even require a constitutional amendment. But of course, it will depend on the actual model that we want to come up with. Thanks.
Thank you, Vusi. David?
Yeah, to go to Karam's question about the SIU first, I think there's a very strong argument for saying that the SIU should be folded into the new anti-corruption body, or that the new anti-corruption body functions and tasks should be newly assigned to the SIU. I think I prefer the first one rather than the second one. And I say this in the sense that I don't think that my opposition to law enforcement being in the new agency means in effect that I don't believe that the new agency should take on investigations of individual acts of corruption. But it should take on investigations of systemic corruption. So, the Gauteng Department of Health, there are enough individual instances of corruption to keep the department busy for the rest of, to keep the law enforcement agencies busy for the rest of their lives. But I mean, what you have there are not rotten apples. You have there a rotten barrel, a rotten orchard of apples. And so you have to understand what is it that has happened to that department, that almost every single agency in the department is corrupted and almost every decision taken by the agency is corrupted. The same may be said about the immigration section of the Department of Home Affairs. Now that I think is right for investigation by the new agency. And when you come across individual instances of corruption, you refer them to the law enforcement authorities. In the same way that if the law enforcement authorities goes into the Gauteng Department of Health and says, we'll prosecute X and we'll prosecute Y, but actually the whole thing is corrupted, it should refer that to the SIU or to the new agency. Now, the advantage of the SIU, of course, is that not only does it have quality leadership, but it also has investigative capacity. And I think that that's the kind of investigative capacity that the new agency should have, not the capacity to investigate and prosecute individuals for crimes, but the capacity to investigate systemic corruption in institutions and departments of state. I don't agree that there's been no sustained support for anti-corruption activities. I think the problem is that organizations like Corruption Watch and OUTA and some of the investigative agencies, media agencies, have fought a sustained opposition to corruption, and the degree of exposure, I mean, not only from the Zondo Commission, but from Amabungane and from OUTA and some of the anti-corruption organizations has really been outstanding, actually. But those institutions can't operate at scale. That's always the problem with NGOs and civil society organizations and even the media, is that it's very difficult to operate at scale and to absorb the whole population, if you like, into this. And a very important part of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy is precisely that it should be, I forget the term used, an whole of society approach. And that's right, you know. Could you imagine the impact of posters across the country with, I don't know, Brian Molefe's face on the wanted poster? You know, those kind of provocative, irreverent things are what needs to be done in order to draw the public into this activity. And I think it can be done. And I think this is what this new agency, above all, should be doing. Say, a very active communication strategy and campaigning strategy. I'd also, finally to say, I'd mentioned the institutions that need examination under the President's mandate or requirement to look at the anti-corruption architecture. Something like the Investigative Directorate is a candidate for that examination. My prima facie view is that I don't see that it's doing too badly in the located where it is located, and it just seems to be bearing fruit, which is why I wouldn't mess with it too easily. But you want to look at its activities and its capacities. Another thing, which I'm sure you've all heard mention of, but like me, don't understand really properly at all, is the Fusion Centre. Now, the Fusion Centre, what the Fusion Centre actually is, I think, is the law enforcement agencies becoming frustrated with the ACTT, not able to coordinate their work there, and simply decamping elsewhere. So they've gone to the FIC, which is also a body that is very competently led. And so they've just, taken their own decision to go elsewhere and leave behind all the other agencies that they can't discuss anti-corruption strategy with. And then to Marianne's point about implementing the strategy, you're right. And of course, that was a very important thing to leave out. The National Anti-Corruption Strategy is not only a strategy, but it has an implementation plan as well, a very detailed implementation plan with the 6 pillars and then projects identified under each of the 6 pillars that would realize the strategy, that would implement the strategy. And because the thing has taken so damn long up to now, it took the president nearly 2 years to appoint the anti-corruption agency. Because it's taken so long up to now, the reference group that developed the strategy also has passed on to the new agency ideas about priorities for implementation of the strategy. And there are a variety that, you can, just going to the Treasury and asking them what the hell has happened to this procurement bill that has been going around for about, I think, 7 or 8 years, would be part of the implementation plan. But there are ideas about implementation of the strategy and priorities to be undertaken. But it partly depends on the strength of the Secretariat, because a council is actually a part-time body, although there's some of us who are spending much of our time watching cricket and could probably do more work than they are doing for free, I should say. But it does depend on the strength of the Secretariat, how much implementation work is being done. And I would support a strong Secretariat, and hopefully to be able to hand over to the new agency, a portfolio of active implementation activity. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I can strongly endorse watching more cricket. Marianne.
Very briefly, Sarah's point just about, context matters. and the politics of the context, and the fact that the State of Capture report ever saw the light of day was about the independence of the public protector inside a compromised landscape to still be able to put that report with much resistance. So, there's been a long argument that maybe you don't necessarily want something which can be captured. So the question is, has the context changed? Is the window still open? To David Bruce's point about, being distracted maybe by this council or agency, no, it's not either or, it's and. One has to strengthen very much the existing capacity of the law enforcement agencies. And I think the SIU has got lots to teach us, the FIC, the MPA getting its act together. So it's not an either or. And then finally, in terms of the politics of corruption, who can be against corruption? It's political campaigns all around the world on the back of an anti-corruption all over. I mean, that is a doctoral thesis, probably been written already. But we need to be aware of some of the unintended consequences of some of our anti-corruption interventions. I'm thinking of the funding of political parties. For many years, Global Integrity would have a scorecard which would show that the lacuna and where things were not working in South Africa was the funding of political parties. So it took 20 years. It's a very interesting case study from EDASA all the way through to My Vote Counts, the role of civil society. Now we have the act in terms of the funding of political parties, and the ANC as the leading party seems to have run out of money. And that could potentially create new opportunities for how do we fund our activities. I'm just saying one needs to be cautious about what we're lobbying for, what's in the strategy, and finally I want to end on how we monitor its effectiveness. What I find a little bit concerning is the reliance on the Corruption Perception Index is going to tell us whether we've succeeded or not in our anti-corruption strategy, and there's a big red flag there. We need to have more refined tools, I think, of assessing whether when we meet here in 20 years' time, will we have succeeded? Let me remind you, in 1999, the Public Service Commission brought out a 4-volume book called Fighting Corruption.
Thank you to all the panelists, to Vusi Pikoli, David Lewis, and Marianne Camerer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the panelists and the facilitator for keeping to time. Thank you. Can I just call on Devi to introduce the next panel and to just tell you that we'll eat into some of your tea and some of the lunch, just so that we keep to the end time. Yep.
Good morning, everybody. We will now be discussing the issue of whistleblower protection reform. We'll be joined by Richard Calland and Cynthia Stimpel virtually, and our panelists in person today are Moepeng, Valencia, Talane, and Thandeka, Gqubule-Mbeki. Nice to see you. Can you join us, please? Nice to meet you. Okay. All good. So our topic for this panel is on whistleblower protection reform. This is something we heard quite a lot about yesterday in the previous panels and discussions. And it's something that the Chief Justice seems to agree with us is extremely important. He's dedicated a lot of space in his reports to how important whistleblowers have been in exposing what we know about state capture and how important it is to protect them. Whistleblowers in this country and all around the world face severe risks from victimization and ostracization to severe career consequences, drawn-out disciplinary hearings, loss of employment, even being blacklisted in their areas, to public smears, reputational damages by people with significant political clout. And not only do these consequences harm exactly the people that we need in the public administration, but it discourages others from following in their footsteps and blowing the whistle. So the questions we need to face now is, how do we protect these people? How do we enable whistleblowing within the state and public administration? How do we, smooth the process? But also, how do we incentivize it? How do we encourage people to come forward despite everything that they might face? So let me introduce our panelists. So Richard Calland, who joins us online, is an associate professor in public law at the University of Cape Town. He's a long-time expert on issues of governance and provided expert testimony to the Zondo Commission on Parliamentary Oversight and Whistleblowing. He was the former director of Open Democracy Advice Center and is the author of Whistleblowing Around the World. Cynthia Stimpel, who also joins us online, is the director of Whistleblower House and co-founder of Citizens of Conscience Foundation. She is a motivational speaker, speaking on her own story as a whistleblower and making a difference where you are. She's a board member on 4 boards and volunteers at Accountability Now, Radio Veritas, as well as doing community work. Moepeng Valencia Talane is a senior journalist and editor at Corruption Watch. Her work over the years has covered various areas of interest for the organization, including investigations and the anti-corruption projects and campaigns. Moepeng provided coverage of the proceedings of the Zondo Commission for Corruption Watch. Thandeka Gqubule-Mbeki was an economics editor at the SABC, where she was one of the SABC 8 who stood up to growing censorship at the public broadcaster. She has held various editorial roles in South African media and is currently a lecturer at Rhodes in the School of Journalism. She is the author of No Longer Whispering to Power on Thuli Madonsela, and in 2016 she was awarded the NACS Press Freedom Award. Now, I have been told to be quite strict about time. We have 4 panelists and we would like to finish this panel at 11:40, so I will ask the speakers to try to stick to their 10 minutes. And we will begin with Richard Calland, who's joining us online. Richard?
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and greetings, good morning to everybody who's part of this really important conference. I'm grateful to the organizers for organizing the conference. My concern about the Zondo Commission almost from the start was that it might not land, that the work might be undertaken with the thoroughness that indeed it was undertaken. And the compendium of reports that it produced are extremely important historical document, but also documents that have to be tangibly real to people. They have to make a difference. And so I would see this conference as an essential step in ensuring that civil society remains very focused on that task of ensuring that those in power take the recommendations and the analysis of the Zondo Commission seriously and are active in putting in place measures to remedy what went wrong and prevent a repetition in the future. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I regret that. My perspective, 2 elements to it. Firstly, you mentioned my role at the Open Democracy Advice Center, which I founded in 2000 along with Marianne, Camerer, who was on the preceding panel. She and I set that institution, that organization up because we were concerned about the implementation of the 2 laws that emerged from the Open Democracy Bill in the 90s, the one law being PIA, the Access to Information Act, the other being the Protected Disclosures Act. And therefore, ODAC was a law center that was there to support freedom of information, but also to support whistleblowers. And over the 10 years that I was the part-time executive director of ODAC, I encountered many whistleblowers. I got to, I think, develop a reasonably good understanding of what is an incredibly difficult, complex terrain. Everything I say about whistleblowing and whistleblowers, however, is from the vantage point of an advisor and a legal analyst or governance specialist, and not as an actual whistleblower. And I pay tribute to actual whistleblowers, two of whom are on this panel. Indeed, I think, Chair, it's useful that I go first because my remarks will be relatively uncomplicated. My attempt is to build a very simple framework for how we might approach this really important phase in whistleblowing history in South Africa. We clearly need to reform, as Zondo says, the legislative environment, and we need to do so with real sense of purpose. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is lay a simple framework for how we might go about thinking through that reform process. In doing so, let me try and share my screen. I've had success and failure over the years in doing so. So let me see if I can achieve it. I have to try and find a PowerPoint. Let's see if it's that one. No, that doesn't look very promising. I've got too many screens open. Can someone at that end do it? I know I did share my screen with, no, here I found it. Very good. Let's see if that works. Yes, here we go. And then I must just simply start the process of showing the slides. There we go. All right. Can everyone see the screen?
I'm afraid not.
Oh.
It says you're sharing your screen, but we don't see a presentation.
Let me press resume share, it says. It says my screen sharing is paused. Wonder why. All right, I'll stop share. Let me try that again. Sorry about this. Yes, where am I now? That's not it either. I'm so sorry. It seems to have vanished now, hopefully. I did share it with colleagues there. I wonder if they could be, oh no, here it is. I'll try again. Right, is that sharing?
Yes, we can see that now.
Wonderful. Okay, so starting points, two very simple points, which I think we can all readily agree on. Firstly, we really need whistleblowers. What I learned through those 10 years at ODAC was that whenever anything goes wrong in an organization, whenever there is wrongdoing, corruption, sexual harassment, anything of that nature, there is always a witness. There is always somebody who sees or hears or knows something about what is going on. And the only question then is, will that individual human being take a step to bring that information to the attention of those with the authority to do something in response? And I think all of our efforts around thinking about whistleblower needs to be directed towards imagining what it is like to be in that person's shoes at that moment, and to think about how best to organize the system of governance and law so that they are encouraged to safely step forward and share that information at that critical moment. And we know, secondly, that of course this is a dangerous thing for many whistleblowers, particularly in our context. What then is the framework for thinking about legal reform? What I said in my short submission to the Zondo Commission was, firstly, one needs to think about who, what is the definition of a whistleblower? Secondly, one needs to think about for what sort of disclosure should attract the attention of legal protection, because there are disclosures of information which do not fall under our definition of whistleblowing for all sorts of reasons that we can discuss later if there's time. And then I think the most critical issue, again, putting oneself in the shoes of that whistleblower at that moment, or that putative whistleblower, is to whom do they share the information? Where do they go to disclose? To what organization, institution, or individual? And that seems to me a really critical question. Though again, I will humbly step aside on that view, depending on what the whistleblowers on this panel have to say about that particular point, because they have faced that particular challenge. It seems to me that and there's a bit of mea culpa here, but it seems to me that the underlying concept, the fundamental pivotal concept within the Protected Disclosure Act may be misguided. The underlying premise, as it says on my slide, was that the employer and the employee share a combined collective interest in fixing or preventing things from going wrong. And therefore, the employer will be a receptive audience to when an employee comes forward with information. Of course, what we realize now is not only is that not always the case, but often, in fact, that may be a deadly misapprehension of the situation. And so therefore, we need to probably escape that pivotal binding concept at the heart of the Protected Disclosure Act and move into a different way of thinking about this relationship and about where the whistleblower sits in the constellation of organizations and structures and power relations that circulate around a particular individual at a particular time. What are the objectives of legal reform? Before embarking on any reform process, I think one needs to be as clear-minded as possible about what one is trying to achieve. I think there are three things which I table for discussion. The first is to widen the scope of legal protection for whistleblowing. Already there has been a reform a few years ago which did extend the legal ambit of protection for certain disclosures beyond that of the original employee labor law-based definition in the original Protected Disclosures Act of 2000. Secondly, and probably most importantly of all, to maximize the security of the whistleblower, to enable the whistleblower to, as far as is actually humanly possible, disclose in a way that will be safe and will not expose that individual to undue risk. And thirdly, Chair, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, to incentivize whistleblowers to come forward and disclose information. I know from my own experience, direct experience of advising whistleblowers, often whistleblowers will reach a conclusion, putative whistleblowers will reach a conclusion, the risks are too great. This is not for me. I don't have the character. I don't have the stomach for it. I'm not brave enough. And that's often a very reasonable position to arrive at. Since we need whistleblowers to disclose, since we need them to be the proverbial canary that goes down the mine and has that sixth sense, that nose for sniffing out what may be dangerous and what may be going wrong with an organization, we do need whistleblowers to come forward where they can do so safely. And we therefore need to think about incentivizing. So 5 suggestions, which I'll simply headline, Chair, in the interest of time. 5 suggestions around how to then proceed in responding to this triple-headed set of objectives for the reform process. Firstly, to widen the scope of what constitutes an act of whistleblowing and to do so as broadly as possible. Others are already applying their minds to that, and I think there's some useful thinking about that already out there, so I won't dwell on that. The second is to, and this is, I think, my crucial point or my main message to the audience today, is to maximize the places where and to whom the whistleblower can go to make the protected disclosure. Again, putting ourselves in the shoes of that whistleblower at that moment where they face the proverbial fork in the road between remaining silent, putting their head in the sand essentially, or taking that civic duty step forward and being able to make a safe disclosure. We have to make that choice as easy as possible. And I think, subject to what my colleagues say on this panel, I think one of the things we should be looking to do is to maximize the number of places that you can go and disclose. Because as we know, institutions and organizations can be captured. What may be a safe place to go and disclose on a Wednesday may by the following Monday no longer be as safe because of shifts in the political economy, shifts in the structure, shifts in who is in power and in control of those organizations. So the idea that there should be a limited number or even one place that whistleblowers go, I think is a mistake. We should instead be maximizing, making as many different places that whistleblowers can turn to and make that disclosure. Thirdly, we need to review all of the laws and rules that relate to security. Witness protection, I would say, is probably the last resort. When somebody, a whistleblower, has to change their identity, has to go to a safe haven, has to be put under witness protection, I think that is a symbol of failure. It's a symbol that the system is unable to cope with a whistleblower coming forward. But of course, in some situations, it may be necessary. So we need to review all of the relevant governance arrangements to see if they are fit for purpose in terms of providing those protections at that particular moment. Fourthly, in terms of incentive, I was always in the past very much against the idea that there could be a reward for whistleblowing. I was concerned, and the literature suggested that this was a legitimate concern. I was always concerned about bounty hunting, that people would have the wrong motivation for coming forward. 20 years later, I think I've revised my view on that. I think that the circumstances suggest now, for the reasons that I've briefly raised in the introduction, which no doubt we'll discuss in this panel, the circumstances now suggest that we need to shift our view on that. I've read with great interest what Professor John Clara and others have said in support of the idea of a qui tam approach, where whistleblowers can, in a sense, launch their own litigation in relation to whistleblowing and the disclosures they wish to make, and then have a stake in what happens next in terms of the recovery of money. I think those sorts of ideas deserve serious attention. Lastly, fifthly, legal advice. As I said before, whistleblowers at that particular moment where they have to choose between remaining silent and disclosing, they need support at that point. They need legal advice, they need companionship, they need all manner of kind of companionship, I would call it, to help them make that choice, to make the best possible choice, to decide how to disclose and to whom to disclose. We need to invest in that. So thinking about the institutional arrangements involves, in my view, also thinking about the funding and the practical arrangements for whistleblowers to get legal advice. We can't rely on the NGO sector alone. We need to put in place, I would suggest, some kind of statutory body that can provide that kind of assistance when it's needed. So, having said all of that, we have to recognize that in the area of whistleblowing, the law is a very blunt instrument. We need a shift in culture. We need a massive mindset shift so that whistleblowers are seen not as heroes or villains, but as people simply doing their civic duty, so that they are respected, treated with absolute care and attention, and not therefore suffering the kind of dangerous reprisals and harm that we've seen so often, sadly, in recent years. Thank you very much, Chair. I've tried to be as quick as possible, and I hope that's a useful starting point or basis for the conversation that will flow and which I am very much looking forward to. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your insights and also for your excellent timekeeping. We turn now to our other virtual panelist, Cynthia Stimpel.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to the organizers, Pari, Kazak, the attendees, my fellow panelists, and fellow whistleblowers. So I'd like to start with a quote stating that by Albert Camus, "A man without ethics is a wild beast loosed upon the world." According to recent research done by Gibbs in 2021, the Gordon Institute of Business Science on whistleblowers, they found the following. Growing accounts of corruption across South Africa's public and private sectors have highlighted the role of whistleblowers. Whistleblowers were an actor who often lies at the core of uncovering unethical corporate or state conduct. The accounts of whistleblowers in the civic, civil, and criminal courts, the media, and at investigations like the Zondo Commission, along with the tragic assassination of whistleblowers like Jimmy Matlala, James Nakambula, and more recently, Babita Deokaran, show what is at stake for both whistleblowers and society. It is arguably that without the impetus of whistleblowers, the detailed investigations, the evidence of witnesses and experts, the laying of charges, the judgments of courts and commissions, the findings of innocence and guilt, and the infrequent prosecution of those responsible would have been stymied. Whistleblowers all too often suffer from extreme repercussions of society once they blow the whistle. They become the pariahs, the outcast, treated like lepers. They avoid People avoid their company. People don't even speak to them. They're made out to be liars, disloyal to their peers, colleagues, and places of employment. Charges are trumped up against them. They are alleged to have committed misconduct. They are gaslit. They are labeled as disgruntled troublemakers or disgruntled employers, non-team players, poor performance. The plight of whistleblowers suffered by mostly has been extreme. Some have lost homes, lost jobs, lost both current and future income. I can attest to that personally. Whistleblowers lose their self-confidence. They start doubting themselves. Many go through mental depression and have to consult trauma counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. Some lose friends, families, their spouses, or their children. Some never recover, and some even commit suicide. Some assassinated, murdered, killed for speaking the truth. Through the many surveys and research conducted by universities and civil societies and organizations, and through speaking to many whistleblowers, in South Africa particularly, one finds that whistleblowers are indeed faced with the challenging situations which are listed below. In South Africa, they are definitely not protected by the current Protected Disclosures Act. Here are some of the shortcomings. There is no dedicated whistleblower NGO or Section 21 or Chapter 9 organization specifically set up to deal with disclosures. There is no platform or agency. The Protected Disclosures Act of 2000 and the amended Act of 2017 is still inadequate. The PDA and PDAA has not served what was intended at the time and what their purpose was. It was designed as a workplace remedy. It was linked to the Labour Relations Act. The Companies Act and other legislation are ignored for whistleblowers when they have stated their cases. These need to be aligned and linked. There's a lack of accountability in PDA for corporate entities if they fail to implement the measures to alleviate the plight of whistleblowers. There are no consequences for these perpetrators either. The legislation lacks a mechanism that can oversee the implementation of the law. There is no confidentiality for the whistleblower or the diligent or sensitive handling of the reports and for keeping their anonymity. The case in point is Babita Deokaran and many other whistleblowers whose names have been pasted out there and given the wrong impression. Industry regulators need to take a stronger, clearer stance on ethics and compliance. There is no whistleblowing ombudsman or regulatory body with jurisdiction over companies to ensure that the companies do the right thing, and there's no consequence management for these people. The majority of companies victimize and intimidate whistleblowers. The big companies always win. Case in point, SAA, PRASA, Transnet, Denel, and many more. There are no support systems. The whistleblower suffers in all spheres of life, their health, physical and mental, financial, accompanied with rejection, depression, ostracization, loss of dignity, loss of self-worth, loss of their place in society, loss of the credibility and their good credit record standing. The most contentious issue, though, is financial support for the whistleblowers. The tendency for disputes and legal cases to continue for months into years, the cost of the small person, the David, fighting the bigger corporate, the Goliath, has a long-term impact on their financial resources. The case in point here, Martha Ngoya. The legal fees continue to accumulate and their debt is increasing while the employers drag the matters to court and adopt delaying tactics at every turn. This action of fighting for your personal right has a long-term effect on your health and your mental state. The legal processes is skewed towards the employer. And it is only when organizations like OUTA or PLAF or Corruption Watch enter the fray to assist whistleblowers that they are able to cope with the financial strain of the legal battles. Many of these whistleblowers have experienced the legal support without a fixed income because they lack the finance to continue to live and provide for their own families. they not only need money for lawyers, but they also need it as a support structure. This brings us to what has been recommended in the recent state capture recommendations. There were 4 on the protection of whistleblowers. The first one being to ensure that any person disclosing information to reveal corruption, fraud, or undue influence in the public procurement activity be accorded the protection stipulated in Article 32.2 of the United National Convention Against Corruption. The second point was identify the inspectorate of an agency as the correct channel for making such disclosures. The third one, authorizing this litigation unit, which was previously in the recommendations of the Zondo recommendations, to incentivize such disclosures by entering into agreements to reward the giving of such information by way of a percentage of the proceeds recovered by the strength of such information. And then the last recommendation, authorizing the offer of immunity from criminal or civil proceedings if there has been an honest disclosure of the information which might otherwise render the informant liable to prosecutions. So,
can I give you 2 minutes, please, Cynthia?
Yes, I'm at the end. So suggestions that we have, being this is based on the, is that in the Gibbs paper, they said prioritize and focus execution attention on actively building an ethical culture in organizations, schools, universities that welcomes whistleblowing. This has been spoken on before. Active involved in non-executive members of the board, prioritize organizational communication, make it easy and safe to blow the whistle, take steps to avoid whistleblowing abuse, monitor and manage the investigations, take action against unethical conduct. In the Corruption Watch survey that they did, Daring to Act in 2021, they also made recommendations that they must implement and establish an agency in line with the proposals contained in the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, that leading this establishment of the above agency must ensure that there is funds used from the criminal asset recovery account and used to support whistleblowers who are seeking legal security and mental support. Steps must be taken regarding individuals and institutions who are found guilty of intimidating and harassing whistleblowers for their disclosure, and they must be criminally sanctioned. And then with a more recent active citizens movement have made recommendations to the State Capture Commission in 2021. And their recommendation has been that they should create a commission similarly to the Competition Commission, whereby in the commission they can draw a parallel to the shortcomings of the PDA, and therefore they can use the model of the Tribunal Competition Commission that is practical in resolving these shortcomings. And then lastly, defend our democracy. In a recent conference held on the 1st and 2nd of July, they also discussed the areas around State Capture Commission. And they advocated that, again, advocate for civil society to have a comprehensive and coherent response to the Zondo Commission report, that there must be consultation done with other civil society in developing and monitoring a tracking system for the implementation of the Zondo Commission's recommendations, and then pledge a support the National Prosecuting Authority to ensure that we put pressure on and that prosecutions do take place, and that they have to work on a whistleblowing with all whistleblowing organizations to finalize a plan to support and protect whistleblowers. So these have already been done, and then what we need to do is engage the private sector on reforms, because little has been said in the Zondo Commission report, and there needs to be action taken to eradicate state capture within the private sector as well. Obviously, legislation has been done in the UK and USA regarding whistleblower reform. However, recently with the German Federal Ministry, they've instituted new legislation whereby they are saying that there must be internal reporting and external reporting channels. This can then be separate so that who is responsible for the receipt of processing these reports can be held done in such a way that it serves a central point for whistleblowers and at the same time check the validity of the whistleblowers' reports. In conclusion, actions have already been done to date. There are many assisting whistleblowers. There's a whistleblower house that's been established in February 2022. To date, they've assisted 87 whistleblowers and literally filling the gap that's not being filled by the current government or anywhere else. Funding is still a key focus, and therefore we again recommend that funding should be given to those whistleblowers or to anyone supporting whistleblowers. I'd like to end with a quote: "Integrity is the choice between what is convenient and what is right." I thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I'm finally going to turn to the panelists who have joined us in person today. Our next speaker is Moepeng.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. The well-organized conference it's been quite an experience. I followed online yesterday, the whole of yesterday, and I was quite captured. I was quite interested in in all the panel discussions, of course, very great insights. I'm equally nervous about talking about whistleblowers because I think the conversations that we've had in the country about whistleblower protection and support have been many, and the resolutions or answers have been quite few, particularly because government isn't leading the conversation. Civil society seems to be at the forefront of what needs to happen. I'd like to start off by talking about where there were gaps in the Zondo recommendations in terms of the whistleblower protection issue. And probably not all, because not all of them the Commission's fault, of course. But I think South Africa is poorer for the Zondo Commission not having concluded the law enforcement work stream, evidence stream in its public hearings, as well as in terms of coming to the point where they make findings and recommendations. This is because law enforcement has to play a role in the broader framework in terms of what happens with regard to whistleblower protection. When a whistleblower needs protection, when the whistleblower requires their safety is compromised, or the safety of their members of their families are compromised, they absolutely need the response from law enforcement that will be missing from the Commission not having established guiding principles for how law enforcement agencies should go about reforming their own structures, so that the public confidence that is required for them to move forward with their work is indeed established. The other issue, I think, as far as the Commission is concerned, is that it relies, the area of whistleblower protection relies very heavily on the successful establishment of this anti-corruption agency. Outside of that, there doesn't seem to be a place for where else an alternative that the Commission may have arrived at for whistleblower protection and the framework that has to be developed in that area. And I say this because, as Cynthia has just said, there are many whistleblowers out there who are seeking legal advice, waiting for legal advice, who may not know or may not have known at the time of blowing the whistle within the limitations of the PGA, that things would happen the way that they have for them. I'll tell you about briefly the story of a whistleblower who came to Corruption Watch back in 2018, who at the time was a middle management official of a local municipality in the Northwest. I don't know if you remember that case, David, but what he brought to us was a very interesting case of an irregularity in the appointment of a service provider without having followed an open bidding process. And the cost to the local municipality at this point for that service was around just over 200 million rands. And the urgency for him as an official who worked in the field, that was the function that was going to be serviced by this service provider, was that there was a likely extension of that contract. As far as he could tell, all indications was that that contract was to be extended, and then that the accumulated cost over time of that contract would go well into hundreds of millions of rands furthermore. And his worry was that if nothing's done before that extension, at least this is done, that maybe there would be some opportunity to save money for the local municipality. Fast forward to 4 years later, he is currently without a job. He was dismissed in June of 2021 after having gone through a disciplinary process where charges had been trumped up against him for he was accused of having neglected some of his duties. After, of course, he'd been victimized for some time, and the scope of his work had been changed by his bosses to the extent that a whole parallel structure had been established alongside his own that ensured that he didn't get the resources that he required to carry out his daily duties. And at the last opportunity that I got to speak to him, which was earlier this year, he said to me, had I known what was going to happen to me, I probably wouldn't have blown the whistle. And I said to him, I remember your motivation when I first met you, and I asked you, what was it that led you to do it? And he said, Valencia, I come from a privileged background, but I work in a local municipality in a semi-rural community. I get to drive out of that community. I get to go to my home. But the people I live there, the hundreds of thousands of residents who are serviced by this municipality, that is lacking in terms of the delivery of basic services like water and roads and all of that, don't get to escape that. And it just pains me that 200 million rands is going to a service provider who didn't have to fight for the opportunity to do so, for a service that is not necessarily even a priority, should not be a priority for this municipality. And then an additional thing that he told me when we spoke this year was that in the course of the investigation, of course, Corruption Watch took on the investigation, but out of frustration, because he needed us to meet the deadline to implement our investigation, just so that to sort of circumvent the extension of that contract, the impending extension. He went to the Hawks because he felt that Corruption Watch was basically not moving fast enough in that regard. And oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Of course, that investigation was taken on by the Provincial Office of the Hawks in the Northwest. And on one occasion, he was told by an official of the Hawks, who was not necessarily directly linked to the case itself, but said to him, a lot of you guys have the noble idea of what it means to blow the whistle. You see the end point, the justice factor of it. You see certain people being punished, money being recovered and everything, but you don't realize who stands behind the people implementing these irregularities. It turned out that it was a very, there was a lot of political interference in the process of appointing this service provider. So a lot of very influential political heavyweights, leadership of the ANC in the province seemed to have benefited from this contract, and therefore were doing their best to not only block the investigation, but also to frustrate him out of the system. The partial good news is that there has been some accountability. The municipal manager who approved this contract is currently on trial. He's facing criminal charges for having done so. However, like I said, the whistleblower is unemployed. He does not have a job, and he's had to use his pension money to secure his home. And he does not have pension. At the age of 42, he does not have pension to look forward to at retirement. Now, I'll be quick, I promise. Of course, people like that, he's a professional, a well-trained professional who, by circumstances that I've just highlighted, was removed from the public service. But can we really say that we do not need people like him, those like him who have been ousted of the system because they blew the whistle? Do we not need them in the greater scheme of things in terms of how we move forward with this anti-corruption agency, should it be indeed established? Do we not need them to help with the professionalization of this agency and its several numerous components? And can we, as civil society, not find urgent ways to support people like him who are in this position because they thought it was a noble deed and that it would help save the municipality money? Incidentally, the municipality is also one of those that lost money in the whole VBS saga of several years ago. So this is not the only money or the only incident in which it's lost money, but through the actions of this one man, the official who was in charge, the accounting officer who was in charge of the municipality's administration at the time and approved this contract, is now facing criminal charges. Thank you very much. I'll end it on that.
Okay, thank you so much. We now turn to Thandeka.
I'm not a lawyer, but I've been reading law and participating in the drafting of a new Protection and Support of Whistleblower Act of 2022. I'm a media studies academic and scholar, so I've been reading text. And I've been reading the Zondo Commission and our society through post-colonial theory. I am grateful for my agonies and my trials that have been so public, because it shattered me. I've had to regather myself and find new knowledge, new understandings of the post-colony and the vestiges of empire that are with us and come face to face with the crisis of liberal democracy. And thus I knew that my troubles are not about me. So the new gathered self was able to gather a new ontology of self. And that simply means that new knowledge led to new forms of being. In the story of the new act, it is the story of the creation of a model law as a mobilizing instrument to encourage the public, society, and activists to embrace new values, to confront the post-colony and reclaim lost agency. Now, the guys here from Open Secrets know that I was very interested in their work and often put it on air. What fascinated me and fixated me about each of the stories that Open Secrets highlighted, these stories of corruption. They would do stories of the ambulance services in the Northwest. If you remember, guys, those of you who are seated there, they would do stories of the textbooks in Limpopo being undelivered. They did stories about PRASA and the loss of rail and the multiple losses to commuters and the economy. What fascinated me about each of these stories was the disengagement of the South African public, its disenchantment with democracy, and its walking away and turning its back on the public sphere, and the ideal of collectively finding solutions to the problems of society, economic, commercial, personal, social. So we discovered each other in the picket lines. This is how the story of the new act began. The active citizens movement would organize protest action, and we would find each other on the beaches in protest against the death of Babita. We found each other in the benches of the South Gauteng High Court, dashing about from office to office, looking for pro bono legal services. We would sit together outside offices of lawyers, psychologists, and psychiatrists, telling each other, whispering our little secrets. This happened to me, and this is what they did to me. And then the typical question would be, and you too, gal? And then we discovered the commonalities that exist when you fight corruption and corruption fights back. So we decided to sit down and draft a new law that would protect us, because in our intimations we discovered that the Protected Disclosures Act of 2000, as amended in 2017, offers us little hope of meaningful protection. First of all, it is placed in the wrong parts of our legal system. It sits somewhere in the Labor Relations Act. So many of us would be told by lawyers, I don't want to litigate under the PDA. Let's go to the CCMA, get you 6 months, your salary was good, and then you forget about this whole thing. And we would be told to go and argue constructive dismissal rather than argue protected disclosures, because there is something fundamentally wrong with the way we constructed our institutions. One day, my daughter asked me, Mommy, what is so wrong with the PDA? I said to her, listen, darling, it's as if the mouse told the cat that you've been dipping too much into the milk that you have stolen, and now your whiskers have got milk. And the cat would obviously pounce on the mouse, and the PDA requires that the mouse explains to the cat what the cat has done wrong, and the cat would be toast. So we decided then to create a new draft model law to act not only as a rationale for urgent legislative reform of whistleblower law in our country, but to encourage litigators and legislators who take the model law into consideration when drafting future law. We also designed a path for the new Protected Disclosures Act of 2022. First of all, we would take it out of the labor relations frame and put it as part of our human rights law. Then secondly, we would criminalize retaliatory action. We would ratchet up the consequences for those who elect to criminalize and discourage and disincentivize whistleblowing. We would then ratchet up the consequences for organizations that fail to protect whistleblowers. Then we would also open the veil and disincentivize non-disclosure agreements, which are basically shut up money that is often paid to whistleblowers to get rid of the grievance, not to attend to the exposed corruption, but rather to quietly and sophisticatedly get rid of the whistleblower through a bulletproof non-disclosure agreement. So, we drafted the Act to provide for measures in which people, individuals and groups may in the public interest disclose information that relates to unlawful or other illegal conduct or corrupt practices of others, to provide for the protection against victimization of persons who make such disclosures, to provide financial and non-financial support to individuals making disclosures, and to provide for related matters. We went to the Human Rights Commission, and within the Human Rights Commission, they arranged for us to discuss what's wrong with the current existing law, and with their drafters, we began to discuss what the new law would look like. Then the drafting began. And the drafting was done by advocates who are sympathetic to us, and some of them are members of CASAC. We then approached a party in Parliament that has a history of succeeding with moving private members' bills throughout the House. We want it to be discussed not only in the House, but through the public participation programs before legislation is enacted, that it goes to the public. Now, as a communicator, David, I know, fellow member of NACS, that in the context of a broken social contract in society, official communication, even about elections, meets the derision of the public. When your institutions are so debased and so devoid of credibility, the public disengages and disbelieves the messages. You can spend millions. You can even have a perfect institutional arrangement. But if you do not create an anti-corruption movement in this country, our toxic politics notwithstanding, you will fail in your collective society-wide endeavor to heal the beast of corruption in our country that is so pernicious to ordinary citizens. Lastly, so the bill that we are moving is designed to build a social movement. We are coming to NEDLAC, Lisa. We want the bill on your floor to be discussed by the social partners. We are coming to Parliament. We will take our bill thundering through the House. And fourthly, we want, this is what I'll dedicate my seat in NACS to doing, we want the voice of civil society heard. And we want a bottom-up movement, not a state speaking to people, a discredited state speaking to people. through the apparatus of social and ideological control. We will dedicate our efforts to finding a way in which the new agency can have a house of the whistleblower and the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is a multi-trillion-dollar exchange, the most liquid on the African continent, to have an office of the whistleblower for those whistleblowers who blow the whistle on all of this. In all of this, we have been led by members of Corruption Watch, DOD, and of course, we spring forth from the active citizens movement. Thank you. I'm grateful for this invitation.
Thank you so much, Thandeka, and to all of our speakers. Now, we only have 10 minutes for questions, so I'm going to be generous and keep my comments to myself. I'm going to take 2 questions from the floor, and then because we have about 90 people joining us online, I'm going to take 2 questions from the chat room. So I see you, and I see you. And I will ask, please, that we keep our questions brief, and also to the speakers, our answers concise.
Thank you. I am Pops Rampasad, the chairperson of the Active Citizens Movement. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Thandeka for being appointed on NACS. She was a nominee of the Active Citizens Movement. So you can be rest assured, the interest of civil society will be represented there and fairly well. My question relates to some of the panel, the earlier panel discussion. NACS is appointed for a period of 3 years. My hope is that it will not take 3 years before government gets down to implementing some of the recommendations. I believe those recommendations should be implemented ongoing, with the finalization in 3 years' time of probably what this new anti-corruption body, form, shape, etc. should take. Secondly, there's immediate need of funding to contest or to support whistleblowers, and my utmost respect for them. And CARA has, I believe, a substantial amount of money which can be used for that purpose. So I think one of the immediate things is how can whistleblowers access the money that's within CARA? And then recently we heard Minister Lamola saying proposals to better protect whistleblowers should be finalized by March 2022. He hasn't approached us and started a conversation about that yet. And hopefully through the engagement here today, a clear message is sent to government that you need to engage with us. More importantly, you need to engage with whistleblowers. They will tell you what needs to be done. You don't have to hear it from your member of parliament, your cabinet, because they don't probably know the experiences of whistleblowers. I take this opportunity to thank the organizers. It's a well-run conference, and I hope the recommendation arising from here will spur civil society and the rest of the country into action. Thank you.
Good afternoon, or still good morning, everyone. And my name is Mthabisi Moyo, and I'm a former whistleblower myself. I whistleblew. In fact, I made a protected disclosure sometime in 2017 at the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller. And I went through the whole journey of retaliation against myself, leading to dismissal, current unemployment, everything. But it's not all doom and gloom, I think. In the process of unemployment, which I still am, I've managed to further educate myself on what corruption really is. And I managed to attain a Master of Arts in Corruption and Governance degree last year. And it has ignited a passion in terms of how do we better protect whistleblowers and what it is that we face as the the challenges, which I'll quickly run through. Yes, there is high-level focus in terms of whistleblower legislation changes and the conversations that go at high level, which we appreciate. But at the bottom level, the challenges that oneself would go through in terms of the whistleblowing process itself, which I think for the new body, the NACS, which is looking at the implementation of the anti-corruption strategy, should really focus on. How do we improve the whistleblowing process? How do we educate a whistleblower who finds themselves out of the job system? Because most of the times I didn't know I was a whistleblower up until, I would say, it hit the fan. That's when you realize I'm out of the system, and how did I get here? It is because I didn't know the legal processes. You go to the public protector, which for me is key. Having been failed by all the other department institutions, you eventually go to the public protector. But what I've found there, my observation, there is a lack of capacity and skills to deal with whistleblowers that knows exactly what kind of help should be given to a whistleblower. I was told as recently as 2 weeks back by the public protector, after 3 years of waiting, they cannot investigate the victimization one went through purely because it is a labor relations matter. And it is frustrating, but what it tells us is we should focus on the whistleblowing process such that it encourages others that are watching what's happening to you. It's 100 employees that I was working with, and I can tell you no one will ever whistleblow if they're looking at what is happening to oneself. But moving forward, what is my contribution maybe to this platform? I would say let us focus more on an integrated whistleblowing platform. Since we're talking of a centralized agency, if we're looking at an institutional architecture, let us have a whistleblowing agency that is centralized to proactively detect corruption, because right now it's coming at the tail end, but we are failing to improve the detection processes. We already have the SIUs, the NPAs to investigate corruption. Let us improve what is currently going on wrong with the structures we have. But in terms of new developments, a centralized whistleblowing agency, Mem and Louis, would be key for me. And it should also embrace technology, because what you are having right now, there is so much human element that discourages whistleblowing. But you look at other countries, how they've done it. They have embraced digital technology that enhances citizen participation in these processes, and it helps on the integrity and confidence in one getting to whistleblow. I thank you.
Thanks so much. Sarah, we've got questions from the webinar.
Three questions. The first one is from Brendan Greeley, directed to Richard Calland. I agree with most of the points made by Richard, but disagree on his suggestion that there should be more places for whistleblowers to disclose. Possibly creates too much choice for a whistleblower, which could be confusing. What about putting all resources, similar to your suggestion, into one vetted entity that can hold the hands of whistleblowers from the beginning to the end? Then a question for any of the panelists from Kevin Malunga, who asked this question in his personal capacity. He says, this is probably the 10th discussion I've attended on the subject of whistleblowing, and the common denominator is that somebody must do something somehow, and then we forget about it until the next discussion. I've received information from hundreds of whistleblowers in my role formally in the state and as a consultant. In fact, we at the Public Protector's Office made the recommendation to create the commission. What is the next concrete step? And then a comment from Karam Singh. Sorry, I'm just going to paraphrase it. Should we look at a full-blown quitam system supported by the development of a plaintiff's bar, if that's possible? But that would involve significant development. It would involve a significant development for our existing legal system. An alternative system would be the provision of rewards by a government body, possibly the anti-corruption agency. There is a tension between who should lead on this and the mechanism that should be used in terms of law, new law or institution.
Much. Oh, thanks very much. Okay, we don't have a lot of time for multiple rounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to each of the panelists and ask them to give any answers or contributions that they feel are particularly important. And we'll start with the online panelists. Can we start with Richard, please?
Thanks, Chair. I'll just respond to that one point that was made by Brendan Greeley online. I disagree. I think it's fine to have one agency that may be a specialist whistleblowing agency to support whistleblowers. I think there's consensus on this panel and in the audience that that sort of agency should, or that sort of facility or capacity should be available to whistleblowers to be able to advise them, provide the companionship I spoke of earlier, and so on and so forth. But in terms of the actual disclosure, and again, I would sort of defer to the whistleblower whistleblowers on the panel and their own experience in this regard. I strongly believe that a whistleblower must choose and have the right to choose where they take their message, and be able to take full account of all the circumstances. If there's surely one thing we've learned in recent years, and the Zondo Commission explains so compellingly, it is that any agency is capable of being captured. It's almost impossible to insulate any institution or organization from the kind of malign takeover that clearly happened during the years of state capture. And therefore, to put all of the eggs in one place and to say there's only one place you can take your disclosure, I think would be a profound mistake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cynthia, do you have anything you would like to add? Cynthia, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm answering Mr. Thabisa Moyo. Thank you for your bravery and thank you for being able to stand up at the time, but I'm truly sorry for your loss. Yes, I agree with you. There are no mechanisms that one could go to. That was from my first experience. We've started Whistleblower House effective this year in February. So there is now a place for whistleblowers to go to. We're fulfilling the gap that our legislation and every other area in our country is not fulfilling. So Whistleblower House is there. What we're currently doing is working with a legal firm to set up a handbook just for whistleblowers. All the handbooks that have been done by the Ethics Institute, Corruption Watch, PARI, is a method of how to blow the whistle and where to go. What we're doing now is that when that whistleblower is faced with it, how best can they save themselves from and protect themselves? So looking at anonymity, looking at understanding what you're going into and then understanding the repercussions you're going to face. So yes, that handbook will be out shortly. We're busy working with that. And then for Mr. Moyo, if he wants to contact us, if there's anything we can do to still help him, we will try our best. We're working with the Psychological Society, with the Psychiatric Society, the dentist, the medical, because whistleblowers cannot have medical aid and don't earn, and therefore here's a way of getting some help in some way. We've also working with a coaching organization that helps them come past this step of having whistleblown and now you need to reinvent yourself and become something else. So please contact me. You can get my details from Devi. To answer Brendan Greeley, you wanted to know if there was any other way, and Advocate Kevin Matlunga. Yes, the Whistleblower House is the next step at this point in time. I do agree we need many other assistance for whistleblowers, so, and many civil societies to be involved. So already whistleblowers can go to active citizen movement, they can go to Corruption Watch, they can go to OUTA, they can come to Whistleblower House. And we are working together in many ways to see how we can even Ahmed Kathrada defend our democracy. So just find an avenue. And what we're trying to do in Whistleblower House is to hold your hand through the process. We definitely feel that that's what's needed for the whistleblower, that we look at you and try and solve your problem where you are, with your families, with your finances, with just getting a meal on the table. And that's how basically we're trying to work to help that whistleblower on a holistic basis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Okay, final comments from our panelists in the room. Moepeng, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I just want to say, I agree with what Cynthia's just said. There is an important, it is very important that whistleblowers get the support that they need from organizations such as ourselves and Whistleblower House. But beyond, of course, advice, legal advice, financial advice, or whatever the case may be, they also need mental support, mental, counseling. In some instances, it is like Richard mentioned earlier, a very lonely road, and one that you kind of lose yourself in the process. So absolutely, an additional service that should be formalized in that regard should be the one for counseling for whistleblowers.
Thank you so much. Thandeka, your final comments?
The fund. There should be a fund that exists somewhere in the state, and it must it must be legally established, and the appropriate place for the fund is in the Anti-Corruption Agency and its office on whistleblower. And the courts must be able to give PDA awards for compensation for loss and for reward on successful prosecution to whistleblowers who've litigated successfully, and they must be able to order from the courts that people be able to draw on that fund. The second thing I just want to say to fellow whistleblowers is this. This is a society-wide problem. The problem is not you. And if we begin to act, lose the collective careerist individualism and act collectively and reach for old African values like the search for honesty, collective solutions, holding each other's hands, joining, network yourself to death in order to solve these problems. There are problems have solutions, and those solutions, particularly in Africa, are collective, and they are solutions to society's problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of the speakers for their insights and contributions today. This has been a very insightful panel, and I would like to thank all of our participants in the room and online. This brings us to the end of the panel on whistleblowing, so I'm going to hand over to Lindiwe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devi and the panelists, for this somber panel. We will be back here at 11 sharp. We have 10 minutes, so if we can be quick about it. Thank you. Oh, no. What? Okay, at 12. Sorry. I'm an hour behind. 12 o'clock.